Hello and welcome back to the AI Ethics Now podcast. My name is Tom Ritchie and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Dr. Chahna Gonzalez, Senior Lecturer in Marketing and Programme Director for the MSc International Marketing at King's Business School at King's College London. Chahna's research examines how generative AI is transforming critical thinking and academic writing in higher education. Her recent work explores what she calls epistemic offloading, the process by which we're increasingly delegating reasoning and justification to AI tools like ChatGPT. She's exploring what this means for authorship, legitimacy, and agency in learning. Chahna, hello.
Hello, thanks for having me, Tom.
No, great. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. I'm really excited actually to have this conversation.
Great, thank you. Well, let's get started then. What brings you to this conversation on AI ethics, please?
So I've been using ChatGPT since the day it became available, and I really wanted to be part of the discussion about how people, us academics, the public, but also especially students, how they were actually using generative AI in practice rather than how we imagined they would use it. So I think the conversation about AI ethics is, it's very multidimensional. There are a lot of aspects for us to consider, but I really wanted to be part of the conversation in being able to translate what students are saying they're doing, as opposed to what we think is happening in working groups where we're very separated from the reality of it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And we've done previous podcasts with students where it's almost like the secret life of students with AI, where we make a lot of assumptions, I think, as academics, when the reality is that we know students are using these tools in ways that we perhaps don't think about, haven't considered. And I'm also aware that for lots of students, they are slightly nervous AI explainers. And so they don't want to say they've used it. And so it makes it really difficult with things like assessment design, with course design, not to make sure that students aren't using it, but to actually help them use it in an effective way and to help them develop that critical AI literacy, I suppose. And on that point, your work speaks about the concept of epistemic offloading. I wonder if you could explain what that means and why you think it matters when we're using tools like ChatGPT for academic writing or assessments.
I think just linking to your previous question before I explain that, I think one of the things that I was aware of is that a lot of our discussions do kind of center on the idea of detection and misconduct. And I wanted to show a little bit more of the more complex reality of how people are using it. So this idea of epistemic offloading kind of refers to the parts of the reasoning work that students are now offloading to the tools, not just the effort to have AI generate a piece of text for you, but how much of the thinking about what you're doing are you delegating to the AI? And I wanted to understand where students felt that they needed to do that thinking themselves versus where they thought it was appropriate for AI to take those reasoning decisions on their behalf. And some of what I found through interviews of students were them saying that they're using AI to not just summarize readings, but also interpret them, for example. So when they have comprehension activity, they might have been given an academic article to read and a few comprehension questions. They are using AI to decide which parts are actually appropriate to give in response to those questions. So it's now not just the summarization effort. They were using it to generate argument structures and the outlines for essays and pieces of coursework. And again, allowing the AI to decide what might be valuable to submit at that piece of work, identifying key points that they should focus on, and almost pre-evaluating the quality of their draft as well. So I wanted to focus on this idea of epistemic offloading because what I saw was that this is shifting the responsibility of the core intellectual work from the student. And the students have accepted that AI has become a part of their reasoning process, not just a convenience tool. They were also discussing how they consider what counts as intellectual effort. So what do they think is appropriate in response to the task that we've set them? And I thought actually that is why this matters, because we don't know what students think is important for them to do themselves. We're making a lot of assumptions about what we want them to do themselves and why we think that's important according to our curriculum design, our accreditation, the way our programs are benchmarked in terms of intellectual levels, for example. But that doesn't translate to the students often. They're not privy to a lot of that information and they see it very differently. So that's kind of where this idea of epistemic offloading came from. And I thought it was important to really dig more deeply because there's a huge gulf between these two sides on that particular topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, is there a point where you think offloading becomes problematic, or do you think it's more how it's done by students that people are finding problematic?
No, I think it can be problematic for various reasons. I think one of the most obvious points is that sometimes, as academics, as instructors, we want the students to go through certain processes in order to learn. We want them to be able to make connections. We want them to achieve specific goals. And if they're skipping those steps, then ultimately we haven't achieved our intended outcomes. So that is problematic. I think the other thing that's problematic is that we don't explicitly tell students they have to go through. And AI has kind of revealed that if students skip these steps, again, we don't achieve our outcomes. But it also means that we're now not sure of what we're not achieving from the academic side. So I think there are those reasons. And then, of course, for the outcomes of students learning, we don't know which of those steps are detrimental for them to skip. We've not yet had a chance to evaluate that. So I do see offloading as problematic, but I think at this early stage, I think it's more important that we try to understand it. And it is a very complex topic. So I think there are so many different ways that we could look into it in order to better understand it. And then maybe we could have a more informed conversation about when and why it's problematic.
And I think we as academics really need to consider students are using this, whether or not they're going to tell us. We know they are, because it's a tool that helps them release some of the pressure that is put on through courses being very expensive, the need to succeed at any cost, and the kind of systemic problem academia seems to have with the concept of failure, and that we frame it as a really bad thing. So I get why students are using it.
Yeah.
And you argue in your work that AI tools are changing not just how we write, but how we think and how we take responsibility for what we produce. Could you share some examples of what that shift looks like in practice?
Yes. So students conveyed in some of my interviews that they're increasingly treating AI explanations as provisional interpretations that they should build on. And sometimes they think deeply into them, but other times they accept those uncritically. So that I think that is a very clear example of it changing how we think, because if you had to do all of that work manually, you'd be making all of those decisions by yourself. Then some of the students were explaining that they do rely on AI generated outlines, for example, as the backbone of their assignments. And that shapes how they conceptualize a topic or what they are likely to go back to and refer to in terms of the material that was taught. So I felt this was quite interesting because we could give students 10 weeks of lecture content and accompanying readings, but actually the way that they pull that together mentally is now shaped by AI. So if AI puts emphasis on certain aspects of those 10 weeks as opposed to others, we get a different outcome. Then actually one of the really interesting things was students saying that, they'll give their draft to AI and ask for feedback on the kind of grade that AI would suggest they might get according to their rubrics or the instructions that they've been given. And they would allow ChatGPT to tell them what's missing. And I thought this was interesting because actually it now shifts evaluative judgment. So how students understand what they think is good or what they think is an appropriate level to submit this work at. And actually the machine is playing a huge role in that, not just the human. So I think those are the three things that stood out to me. There was this one other aspect of students describing losing their sense of authorship. They would allow AI to rewrite an entire section of a draft, for example, and they would prompt it with questions, like, does this sound like me? And they were conveying in the interviews that they were asking themselves, who wrote this? Did I write this or did the AI? Is it still my own work? And that kind of spoke to taking responsibility for the work, because they said if it didn't feel enough like their own words, actually they no longer felt it was theirs. But there were different tasks where they thought that was more or less appropriate. And this is kind of where I came to this idea that actually the way we're thinking about what we write, as well as taking responsibility for it, is determined by a lot of different factors when you're going through this process of working iteratively with AI.
And I think particularly your point about how it changes the way that students evaluate what's good is a really interesting and kind of challenging outcome that perhaps we don't think about. Is that an AI will read a rubric in a certain way that perhaps we who've written it don't mean in that way, or maybe it overemphasizes
Exactly.
something. And so students are then submitting things that are not quite what we thought. And then they are then surprised because they're thinking, well, the AI said I'd get a first,
Yes.
but then they don't.
Yeah.
And so that can lead to a number of challenges, I think, in how student satisfaction, I suppose, can be affected, because if you trust that AI is telling you the truth, in quotes, you think, well, I will get a first because it's what it's told me, or I'll get the top marks.
I think that's a really important point, actually. I do. I think, without sort of taking us on a diversion, I think academic understanding of how these large language models work is also important there. There was a really nice paper by Margaret Bin and colleagues. She wrote this paper, Developing Evaluative Judgment in a Time of AI. And I think having seen that work, that was quite early. I have understood from colleagues that actually, because they don't necessarily understand how these models process text, they don't necessarily understand why an AI would value certain aspects of writing over another. Now, recently we were marking master's dissertations, and I had a lot of discussion with my students about what they thought was appropriate for the AI versions of their rewrite versus what they think I've been asking for. And one of the things that came out was that because AI prizes polish over content a lot of the time, so when the AI is used as a co-author, it does interpret different aspects of the rubric as being more important, because those are things that lead to better polish, not necessarily better intellectual depth or better content. And I think, there is a lot more that we could explore going forward to understand, how AI is interpreting our rubrics and how that leads into the skew or development of evaluative judgment amongst the students.
And I think particularly that there is a challenge there with encouraging staff to explore them. And it's not, I think, because staff are unwilling most of the time. I think it's the lack of workload space to actually
Yes.
really sit and understand these things. It would take, people a long time. And as someone who works in this space, I don't fully understand how they
Yes.
work all the
Yeah.
time, and why they pick what they pick. And the kind of the black box nature of AI tools makes it very, very difficult to kind of completely understand the inner workings.
I agree. But I do think a few more of these just very simple conversations, these kind of corridor conversations about what we've observed, what we think is strange, what has intrigued us. I think a lot more of that would be helpful to move that conversation forward, actually.
And it's interesting being in the US at the moment, but also having worked in the UK, is you can almost see some of the reasons why it doesn't happen. Where in the UK, there's a much greater apprehension about speaking about this. It's almost like AI is a dirty word that we don't necessarily want to talk about, because people are afraid that if you're seen to be using it, then that's a bad thing as a staff member.
Yeah.
Whereas here in the US, the universities that I've engaged with while being here have had a lot clearer sense of policy around it and a lot clearer approach. It doesn't necessarily always translate to staff, but you're seeing that staff are at least more open to discuss it. It doesn't mean they want to use it,
Yeah.
but they're open to the idea of it. And I think that is a real difference I'm seeing between the UK and US higher education landscape.
Yeah.
In the UK, it feels very reactive, and in the US, it feels a lot more proactive, and that people are wanting to plan how they can use this in. Whereas in the UK, it's this thing that we're not quite talking about yet,
Yeah.
even though it's definitely an issue and we know it's come up. You mentioned your work the concept of epistemic orchestration. So this is the idea of learning to delegate, question, and reauthor AI contributions, which I think is something that we're also seeing from students, where they feel like if they can just change a few words, take out
Yeah.
the word dwell,
Yeah.
take out the word delve, take the Zs out, take the M dashes out, that they feel like that's them reauthoring. Can you walk us through what true kind of epistemic orchestration looks like as a process, please?
So I'd say this idea is not fully developed. Right? Again, it's emerging from a lot of this data. It involves 4 key considerations. So first of all, what is it that the student thinks is okay to delegate? And a lot of what they've suggested so far are, anything that seems very routine or mechanical, where they feel that they've retained conceptual control over the work, but actually Gen AI can execute this predictably. Then the second part of that is it does involve some interrogation. So they're checking for the logic and the accuracy, as well as the alignment of the output with the task as they had understood it. Then the reauthoring aspect, where they're considering whether it reflects their voice and the voice that they would like to portray in this given submission, and how that might be interpreted by the reader, but also the argument that they think is appropriate to put forward. So the reauthoring part is really the tone of voice as well as the interpretation and the argument. And then withdrawing or avoiding some use of AI in certain aspects. So if they think that the task is not appropriate for AI to do, they will resist using it or avoid using it. Or if they think the task really requires personal insight and reasoning, like reflective activities, for example, then they will refrain. So this orchestration is like, going through these 4 stages of asking all of the questions about, is it appropriate to delegate? Can AI handle it? What am I happy with the outputs? Do I need to change it? Or should I just avoid it completely?
And you also, in your research, speak about the impact of AI on critical thinking. You link to Bloom's taxonomy. And I wonder, based on what you've just said, what have you found about how AI is affecting these different levels of cognitive processes when these decisions are being made?
I think the data tells us quite clearly that students are readily offloading what we consider to be those lower level tasks according to Bloom's taxonomy. So anything that just requires some general knowledge, understanding, conveying that through text. So where they're just paraphrasing and extracting key ideas, they're quite happy to offload the lower level Bloom taxonomy tasks. At the middle levels, though, they're using AI in slightly different ways. So even at the level of understanding, they're using AI to help them understand, explain concepts, break down pieces of text or bigger ideas, conceptual ideas for the student, and then using it for application by helping them to interpret their understanding according to the task, clarify theory, and again, like proposing and reworking the structures that they're sort of experimenting with. And then we get to the higher levels. Now, I did one specific study where students were doing a coursework project. So they had to come up with a new brand, they had to come up with the brand assets and the product, and then design a strategy around it. And they were using AI at every stage. So I think it's fair to say that this was quite a creative task. It had a number of steps and a number of sub-components as well. And at those higher levels, the students were conveying that they find ways to use it at every stage. So it could help them brainstorm, it could help them evaluate various ideas before settling on the one that they're most happy with. But they also feel quite a protective instinct around what they're happy to share as part of their submission. So they're using AI, but they weren't completely relying on it, which was interesting. So my argument there was that it can enhance critical thinking because they're using it in this variety of ways rather than just, simply accepting the output and using that in their work. But the thing that becomes concerning even at those higher levels is whether the student is willing to offload judgment and reasoning to the model. And in many cases, that is not what we want them to do, even if they're using it as an assistant. So I don't think it eliminates critical thinking. And I think Bloom's taxonomy gives us a really easy framework that many of us are familiar with across the sector. But it does also indicate where it might be shaping how that process is happening for the students.
And Chahna, your work also examines how risk perception and tech-savviness are influencing students' adoption of using Gen AI in assessments.
Yeah.
Are there any patterns you're seeing? And are there any equity implications that we should be more concerned about in terms of our more tech-savvy students getting an unfair advantage, say?
I think this is hard to answer with regards to an unfair advantage. And I feel like I have to caveat that, I teach marketing where practitioners are also saying that they expect students to be using AI. So the equity discussion goes both ways. Are we being equitable if we withhold that experience from the students? Are we preparing them for equal chances at a graduate job? I think this is, again, a more complex discussion. I think there are a few things that we found from that particular project, that students who perceive themselves to be more tech savvy believe they should be using AI, and they're going to use it with or without permission because they don't want to feel that they are behind their competition when they go out into the working world. And I think this is really a call to academics to think about how this plays out in their particular area. If you teach a business subject, maybe your impression is going to be very different from those who teach the humanities, a broader social science subject. So I think actually the expertise of academics is required here to answer this question about what tech-savvy students might do in that context. I think also then we can answer the question about equity. So how does that look across the types of students that we teach, and how does it look in terms of their graduate reality? I think for us, the equity implications, it really suggests that we should be catering to all students' potential use of AI. I think it would be better for us to foster this transparent discussion with students so that those who feel that they don't want to use it or have reasons that they can't are able to surface those. And then we can think about the very specific situations that we need to address, whether that's institutional sort of infrastructure that needs to be put in place, maybe accessibility considerations, whatever it is. But I would say at the moment, it doesn't feel like we know what those are and therefore can't address them in a reasonable way. At the moment, the students are the best people to tell us. But actually, if we are largely designing our education for the masses, particularly with our large cohorts in the UK. So I think we should be designing under the assumption that all students are at least going to be using free versions of these tools, so access is equitable. And then if there are other ways that we can make it more equitable, we go from that, we move forward from that baseline.
It's a really important point, I think, on this idea that we need to be catering that all students are going to be using at least the free versions of these tools. And you've mentioned in your work about this need for a transparent and reflexive use of AI rather than an outright ban. And I think that's a really important distinction that, again, speaking to colleagues in the UK and working with others there is a feeling that we should just ban AI, just ban it outright. It seems to come up so often in conversation. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit more on what reflexive AI use would look like in practice and how we can make thinking more visible and accountable when AI is involved.
I think for both students and the academics, reflexive AI would mean articulating why you've used AI at maybe a given stage in a process or for a task overall, what you chose to delegate and why, how you checked and reauthored the output, what maybe critical criteria were you holding the output to, what did you think was important before you saw the output and did it feature, and also then which decisions remain yours. So I think there's this this why, what, how, and then which decisions do you think are important for you still to retain? Maybe because AI wasn't capable of delivering on those, but maybe there are other broader contextual reasons why some of that decision making has to remain your own. So I think that sort of reflexive use would be a slower process in some ways. At least I think it would require some very important reflection and introspection on how we make decisions post event or post task. I think also then it would be easier for us to explain what the process was that we went through. And what we have now as academics is this idea that we need to assess process, not product, but we don't really know how to do that. So I think we need to go through this transition stage where both us as the academics, particularly those of us who are setting tasks and assignments, I think we need to go through this process and equally hear how students have gone through it. And then we can understand where the thinking has become visible, maybe the parts that we overlooked or the parts that we underestimated. I think then, having the opportunity to review people's rationale, ideally those would be fairly short. But even this idea of talking through something that you've done so you can explain what you thought was important, I think that would be helpful on both sides. Maybe annotating things. I'm not a fan of this idea of submitting extensive lists of prompts and reflective logs. I'm not a fan of that because the reality is in all regions of the world, we're already overwhelmed in higher education with assessment and the sort of admin tasks that accompany that. So I wouldn't I always try to encourage a shorter approach where maybe we have a few minutes of conversation with students, maybe we capture that in a recorded fashion so we can have a transcript, but that wouldn't take up a huge amount of time if we just took a sample, for example, or have these checkpoints where students may have approached maybe a quarter of a task that they've been set, and we're asking them, what have you done up until now? How have you approached it? So I think there are a number of ways that we could go through trying to understand that reflective process. And that would move us a little bit more from trying to police them to cultivating this more, I want to say, mature and accountable sort of communication around AI. And I also think for academics, it would encourage the movement of the conversation from taboo to more normalized. Some of the things that I've come across is that the more risk-averse students are very hesitant to try it and also to communicate what they've done, partly because they don't fully understand our integrity norms and our assessment norms. They're very concerned about this information being used against them. So they might restrict their own use, but they're also, even if they don't, they're just not going to tell us. And I think academics have an important role to play in fostering this conversation at the classroom level where, they really are the decision makers and the gatekeepers for grades, but also then enhancing their own literacy through hearing what students are doing and feeding in that. Well, I don't want you to use it for that part of the task because I'm trying to teach you how to do X, or I would really like to see you go through this process so that we can diagnose where you get stuck. There are so many reasons that are completely legitimate, but I think the reflective use requires us to appreciate the academic expertise a lot more and foreground it, and then for people to be having more of this conversation at the ground level.
And it feels like that context is sometimes lost in teaching. So on the modules I teach on, I ask students to, when they submit an assignment, to do an AI declaration and just say what you used and a couple of sentences on why you used it for that, essentially. But I think this conversation between staff and students is missing, where we don't probably explain well enough why we don't want you to use AI. We know you can, but we don't want you to, and here's why. Here's the skill set we want you to test or develop or engage with in some way. And I think it's that's the discussion for me that's missing quite a lot of the time. And I appreciate what you're saying about this kind of more reflexive use, but for both students and academics, the onus is not on students here all the time. It needs to be on us, thinking about why are we teaching what we teach, why are we assessing it in this way, and what are we hoping to get, and this bigger question about the impact of Gen AI on assessment is going to continue. But with all of that said, I wonder, Chahna, what steps do you think we can take to ensure a positive future with AI, please?
I do feel like realistically the answer to this has to be quite short term because things are changing so fast. But I think we can experiment with it a lot more. I think we can be more positive about the use of AI if we understand it better. And I think actually back, in 2023, when this first came about, we had a fairly small but important proportion of our colleagues who said, I put my assessment into ChatGPT just to see what it would do, and I was intrigued. Or I think we still need more of that. I think we can enhance the positivity of our future with AI if we have a better understanding of what we think is important, why we are trying to maintain certain human skills. And if we know where the barriers are, because AI can do things so easily, then we can try to address them. And I don't think we have clarity about what we're trying to address right now. I think teaching AI literacy in a way that doesn't just center on tool use and trying to keep up with the hundreds of tools that become available and updated on a weekly basis. I think it would be better for us to think about this in the bigger sense of how our judgment is changing, how our supervision of tools is changing, why we critique things in a certain way, and why it's important for that to continue to happen, particularly among students. So I think it needs to be a bigger discussion. And those people who offer more philosophical perspectives, who offer the bigger picture perspective, actually, I think their opinion is very important at this stage. I think supporting students to learn how to use AI as an assistant. I think we talk about this around these metaphors very often, but there's very little training that is being offered in that way. And actually, I think, saying to somebody, write a poem with ChatGPT is not particularly helpful at this stage anymore. I think there needs to be a little bit more discussion about how, for example, a colleague might allow students to use ChatGPT in class, and what they would do is ChatGPT now generates all of the answers they had for the discussion that they were expecting to host. What do they do next? How do they overcome those challenges? I think that would eliminate a little bit of the fear around engaging with it.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, Chahna. I think particularly around the point of when we talk about AI literacy, we need to stop talking about it as the ability to understand the different tools that exist, because they change so quickly that we would never, ever be able to keep up. And your point about the judgment that we bring to using those tools, I think that's a much more stable ground to begin having these discussions on about why we're using them. And as teachers, what are we wanting our students to get from using them or not in different contexts? And I think that's a much more productive conversation than, well, ChatGPT does X, but Gemini does Y, and Claude does Z, and that's why we have to use Gemini. That fine, but they change so quickly that it's very, very difficult to keep up with what's going on. And I think that in itself could be a full-time job, because I don't know about you, every time I look at LinkedIn or I go online and look at AI articles, there's always something drastically new that's completely changed, particularly now with the rise of agentic AI and the impact that's going to have as well. But thank you so much, Chahna. It's been amazing to speak to you and really, really good to learn more about your research and what you're doing. I'm excited to learn more and maybe have a chat with you at some point in future about where your research has gone to as well. But just wanted to say, thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of the day, and I'll speak to you very soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.